Hey everybody, this is Jimmy. I just wanted to come out and say that I support Donald Trump in his looking to repeal the Johnson Amendment. The Johnson Amendment, if you don't know, was a 1954 legislation passed by future President, then Senator Lyndon B. Johnson, that prohibits 501c3 nonprofit organizations such as churches or the Red Cross in coming out and officially endorsing or denouncing a political candidate for office. It was simply put in place because a lot of politicians simply didn't like churches being involved in politics, and when it was passed without a single objection and without any conversation from anybody because, well, frankly, you know, who doesn't want to hush up your possible political opponents and those who would speak out against you? So a lot of people went ahead and freely voted for the law, and it was quickly put in place and, you know, without much fanfare. But, you know, I believe the law at its heart is unconstitutional because the Constitution and the First Amendment permits all people, regardless if they are a 501c3 tax-exempt organization or not. It allows people to freely come together and assemble. It allows people the freedom of speech and allows people the freedom of worship. And even though people might say, well, what about the separation in church and state? Well, guess what? That has nothing to do with whether or not a church has the right to freely speak, freely assemble, or to freely speak its mind. In fact, I would say that a law that prohibits a assembled body of people from freely collectively speaking their mind as an organization, it would be unconstitutional on face value. So we shouldn't even have to repeal it. It should just simply be a matter of something that gets overturned by the courts. Now, the reason it hasn't been overturned by the courts is, thankfully, the law, stupid as it is, it hasn't been one that has really been enforced. We all know churches that engage not only in overt political activity, but we also know some that kind of teeter the line there, walk a fine line, and invite politicians to speak from their pulpit. Wink, wink, nod, nod. We're not officially endorsing you. We're just asking Hillary Clinton to come speak at our church this weekend. You know, we didn't put out an invitation for Donald Trump or Mitt Romney or whoever, but you know, we're inviting Hillary to speak. So, but this is an official endorsement. But well, wink, wink, nod, nod. Everybody on the same page. Okay, good. That's the sort of thing that's been going on, and you know, it's kind of hard for the IRS to police stuff like that. They don't have the time. They don't have the manpower. They don't have the money to go around tape recording sermons and that sort of thing. So, you know, it's not a widely enforced law. It's kind of like one of those laws that are just stupid and on the books that say, like, you can't walk your dog on the left side of the road on a Sunday before noon. You know, so there are laws like, it's kind of almost a law like that. It exists, and churches are very aware it exists, and many attempt to comply with it, both in not only the spirit but letter of the law. But, you know, there are definitely those churches and organizations out there who do tote it. Now, somebody might say, well, what about the separation of church and state? And they might say, well, when the churches start paying taxes, then they should be allowed to freely speak. Well, first of all, the separation of church and state is not something that prohibits a church or a simple body of people to prohibit or limit their speech. Second, what does paying taxes have to do with your right to freely speak? Over 47%, it is estimated by some, don't pay any taxes in this country. And in fact, most of the country for the first 100 years or so, there was no federal income tax. So I don't see what having to pay taxes has to do with absolutely anything. It's just a red herring that people use to distract from the main issue. And the main issue is this, that the Johnson law, the Johnson Amendment, is ultimately unconstitutional on face value and should be overturned, struck down, and destroyed. Now, some people might think, well, that's going to open a terrible Pandora's box. Who wants to go to a church where all of a sudden somebody stands up on a Sunday morning and says, I endorse Donald Trump, or I endorse Hillary Clinton, or I endorse, you know, the local mayor so-and-so? Well, you know, honestly, in my opinion, while those fears may be real, and some people might think, well, a preacher has the ability to threaten people with hellfire and brimstone, and their eternal fate of their soul is at stake when they go to church and the preacher denounces voting for a certain candidate, well, that is very possibly true. Some churches may engage in such behavior. But I think most churches realize that even without that amendment being in place, that being rather politically neutral when it comes to candidates is really probably the best policy, and is really something that most churches and religious organizations have tended to practice over the years anyway, simply because, well, let's face it, even though a lot of us may agree on the basics of our religion, like that Jesus Christ rose from the dead and that he's coming back soon, we may disagree on finer things like whether there should be universal health care, or whether we should have an active military that polices the world, and what kind of schools we should have, and those sort of things. So I think most pastors are kind of pragmatic in that regard, that they don't want to be divisive over political issues because they see themselves as ministering to spiritual issues. So therefore, they don't really engage in too many hot political issues, because they see that politics has little of anything to do with their congregational life, and they just want to pastor and help people know Jesus. So, of course, there are those churches out there who are very politically engaged and active. You have a lot of historic black churches who have been very proactive and involved in civil rights issues, or you have a lot of Baptist churches that are involved in things like abortion and other, social conservative type issues. And while I think that you will see some churches say, well, yay, the Johnson Amendment is down and struck down and destroyed, so we can say whatever we want, we can endorse and denounce certain political candidates. I still think most religious organizations are going to still kind of, go middle of the road and try to appeal to the most people as possible, and they know they can't do that and reach their mission if they're hyper and super active engaged in politics. But if a church wants to be engaged in politics, if a church wants to speak out on an issue, if a church wants to denounce or support a candidate, it should have the right to do so. Now, such may not ultimately be very wise for them to do so, but they should have that right. And ultimately, why? Because that right is fundamentally guaranteed to them by the Constitution of the United States. And honestly, I don't know why we act like this is such a shocking thing, because prior to the Johnson Amendment, the churches for the first 175 years of the existence of our nation were very involved to some degree in the political process that went on. In fact, a lot of the things that helped form our nation was a direct result of the activity of the church in the pre-colonial days leading up to the birth of our nation. The Revolutionary War was undoubtedly something that was sparked by the preaching of the revivalists who went around the country stirring up the hearts of the people, along with individuals like Ben Franklin who tapped into that and took advantage of that in something. But anyway, not to get bogged down in history, but the church has been involved. But even before the Johnson Amendment, even for the level of involvement that churches had with politics in our country, there are still very many churches whose official polity and practices are not to be overtly political, because they see themselves as dealing with the heavenly realm. The things that belong to God are God's, and things that belong to Caesar's are Caesar's. And a lot of churches theologically hold that view. So even if such an amendment as the Johnson Amendment were struck down, they still wouldn't be overtly involved in politics, because they just don't see that as their calling. They see politics as politics and religion as religion, and a lot of them simply don't mix. There'll, of course, be those who do, but I think we'll see, even if should that be struck down, there'll be a pretty good balance. So anyway, this is Jimmy. Just thought I'd give a kind of analytical thought as to why I support the Trump administration striking down the Johnson law. It's just bad law. It's stupid on face value, and it's frankly just un-American and should be done away with. So anyway.